Hey guys, I'm back, and even though I know you guys are enjoying spring break, I wanted to go ahead and kind of post this lecture on World War One, the course of World War One, and its course as a trench war, which I think I mentioned last time was the absolute worst kind of war you could possibly ever be caught in. And there's a reason why we don't really uh, fight wars like this anymore. So I want to draw your attention to the PowerPoint. I also want to let you know that I'm going to post another video where we're going to do some readings from World War I and practice some document analysis. Now that we know that the 2020 AP exam is going to be a modified 5-document DBQ, I think we should practice document analysis, especially since it must become quick and automatic and has to be done in 45 minutes. So this is going to be a challenge. I think World War I documents really pose a great opportunity for us to do that, especially since they're so fascinating. So we are going to talk a little bit about the course of the war and how it became a stalemate and what that meant for how the war would go and what that would mean for individual countries that were involved in it. So for the first part of this, we're going to look at the first couple years, 1914 to 1915. Notice it's called illusions and stalemate. So illusions because when the war first started, everybody was really happy. Everybody was feeling very nationalistic and patriotic, and many people believed, the British and the Germans especially, believed that the war would be over soon and everybody would be home by Christmas. Now don't forget, the war starts in late July, early August, and they think this is all going to be over in just a matter of a few short months. But it quickly turns into a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in which there is a fight between two parties and it doesn't go anywhere. Nobody's winning, nobody's losing, there are no decisive victories, and so it just kind of stays that way and can last a very, very long time. For that reason, World War I lasted 4 months instead of, 4 years instead of 4 months. And it might have lasted longer than 4 years, except for the fact that countries literally run out of money. And the United States does come in to help break the stalemate, but that doesn't happen until the last year of the war. So, like I said, at the very outbreak of the war, there was a lot of excitement, this belief that there would be a quick victory. There were parades to send soldiers off. Soldiers who were enlisting in the military at the time were young. Some of them were 17, 18, 19 years old. And in the West, though, this quickly becomes a shattered dream that you're not going to go to war to find all this glory and be a hero and come home and be in time to celebrate the holidays with your family. That just very quickly becomes evident as early as September. Now remember, it starts in August, right? Early August. At the First Battle of the Marne in northern France, it becomes evident that Schlieffen plan failed. When the Germans are not able to punch through a decisive victory and the British come in and intercept their march to Paris through the north of France. And in the east, the Russians and the Austrians, even though they are fighting on opposite sides, start to see some failures. Russia especially, they see some major failures and lose a lot of troops at the Battle of Tannenberg and the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. And that happens also very early on in the war. Remember that Russia has not really fully industrialized. So they're fighting with some outdated weapons, and while this is still early on in the war, many Russian troops realize what they're up against. Now, at first, the Russians mostly take on the Austrians. That's their more hated enemy, I guess you could say, is the Austrians. They actually do help to defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Galicia, and they even managed to kick Austria out of Serbia. Unfortunately, this serves to give the Russians a false sense of confidence because later on they're going to find themselves going up against the Germans, and the Germans' weapons are far more sophisticated than what the Austrians have. So let me show you a map of the trenches. Here is northern France and Belgium and the border between France and Germany. This is where most of the war on the Western Front takes place. the war was fought on two fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. But most of the images we see, like in movies and series and documentaries about World War I, they're taking place here because this is where the majority of these very intricate trench networks were built. So if you notice here, we've got the English Channel, England just across, obviously, Belgium right here, and the Netherlands up here. You've got Germany, and then France is the yellow country. And notice that the trenches are dug all along the border, but then also into northern France. And they really, the British and the French together managed to stop the German advance up here so that the Germans, fortunately, do not take over Paris. However, look up here at the River Somme. Right here, you start to see also some Arras, Verdun, and you start to see some of these sites where there's going to be some massive battles that are going to cost millions of lives. Now, keep in mind also that much of this up here is farmland. A lot of it is very flat. There's not really a lot of hills or mountains here. There's some forests that give a little bit of cover, but a lot of this is farmland. It's land that had been cleared for farming, so there aren't many places to hide. If you watch the movie 1917, which recently came out, and I highly recommend getting it on demand if you can, it's an amazing film, you'll see what I mean by the flatness of the land and how plain it was. There's nowhere to hide. For that reason, World War I becomes a stalemate because both sides started to dig trenches as a way to take cover from enemy fire. But these trenches very quickly evolved. They weren't just ditches in the ground. These were very sophisticated trench networks. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of what that looks like. Here's a bigger map. We can zoom out. This is where the Western Front is. As you can see, most of the war happens in France. France takes a huge beating during World War I. They get back up and they keep fighting, but they are definitely going to suffer massive losses here. Then you also see the Eastern Front. Notice that the Eastern Front mostly takes place in what was then, at that time, Russia. And you'll notice, of course, that the Germans made it a little bit farther into Russia than they did into France. That is because the Russians take some seriously heavy losses. And one of the biggest battles here is at the Battle of Tannenberg. The other smaller, but no less important front is down here in the Balkans. A lot of it takes place in Greece, Albania, and this area here above the Aegean Sea, and the Battle of Gallipoli, which takes place trying to defend the Dardanelles in the Ottoman Empire. So here's some images showing you what it looked like when these men went off to war. Look how young they look. A lot of them did it because it would bring them glory and pride. Many of them thought this would be an easy war. So much enthusiasm and nationalism to go around, so many parades. So many pretty girls send them off to war, and it just seemed like every young man's dream to serve their country at this time. We start to see again these sort of like happy civilians, actually celebrating their family members, their sons and husbands going off to war. So here's another map of the Western Front as well. It shows some of the major battles that will take place as well. Okay, but it becomes pretty evident that this is not going to be a glorious war. This is actually going to be a massive slaughter. And the thousands and thousands of men will die in these battles to gain anywhere between a few yards to a few miles of land. That's it. At the Battle of the Somme, for example, which we're going to go into, this lasted 10 months. Thousands and thousands and thousands of men died, and the most advance was made was 5 miles. So both sides dug trenches. The area between two trenches is called no man's land. And no man's land is full of holes from artillery that has fallen. It's very wet and muddy. It is full of debris, barbed wire, dead bodies of animals and horses especially, and soldiers as well. And there's nowhere to hide on no man's land. You are a sitting duck if you stand up above the trench and you go over the top, as they used to call it. So because the trench warfare creates a stalemate, right? I mean, like, you've got both men hiding in trenches on either side, and you have to wait for the other side to make a move, or you make a preemptive move. So both sides were really desperate to break this stalemate and just make some sort of advance. So what they would do a lot of times is they would soften up the enemy, so to speak, by sending a bunch of artillery. They would just bomb the other side to as much as they could. They wasted so much artillery, by the way, in doing this. The other side, when this was happening, the enemy soldier would take cover in bunkers, or they would move they would move it, basically abandon the trench and then come back when it was safer. Then afterwards, the side that had been sending bombs to soften up the enemy then would attempt to cross no man's land. This was called going over the top, because you literally would climb over the top of the trench and try to run across no man's land somehow without being shot or blown up. This was, as you can imagine, a horrible strategy, since both sides had machine guns, and machine guns don't need to be aimed. They're just set on a tripod. You feed them bullets and you spray. And in doing that, you can actually take out entire battalions in a matter of minutes. So many young men were mowed down crossing no man's land. For example, at the Battle of Verdun in France, 700,000 men were lost. 700,000. Warfare hadn't really ever seen numbers like this before. It made it seem as if the young men fighting in these battles were expendable. And in the end, nothing was really gained. You could say that one side won or lost based on how many soldiers were still left standing, but they didn't actually gain anything. A few yards, a few miles of land is all that was gained, but no definitive advance was ever made. So very quickly, soldiers began to develop a sense that this was all senseless and pointless, and their lives really had no meaning anymore. So we're going to start to see a social attitude develop from this senselessness in World War I. We are going to look at the Battle of the Somme a little bit more closely in a different video I'm going to post right after this. What was life like in the trenches? Horrific. I mean, if you think about it, you're in a hole in the ground. It's very narrow. It's very muddy. You would constantly hear the sounds of warfare, or sometimes you would hear nothing at all. You kind of went through these intervals of boredom. There was a lot of downtime in the trenches, so soldiers played cards, smoked cigarettes, gambled. They wrote a lot. Some of the most prized possessions that a soldier had at the time was a pen and paper or notepad, because they would write letters to their family. They would write poetry or journals. And so that's how this entire literary genre of World War I poetry and literature sprang up. Another thing to remember, too, is that because the war takes place in northern France, British and French soldiers were fairly close to their homes. They were less than a day's journey away from their homes for most of them. So that kind of adds to the torture. The idea that home is so close and yet so far really did a number on these guys psychologically. Sometimes the shelling would stop, the bombing would stop for a time. For example, there was a famous Christmas peace that took place when many soldiers actually lost their will to even kill any other enemy soldiers and would simply adopt this sort of live and let live philosophy where they tried to avoid shelling the other side. There was even a sense of like comradeship where, everybody was sort of in this together. And many times soldiers just lost their taste. They didn't even want to kill. They just didn't want to kill each other anymore, because it all seemed so senseless and pointless. And really, for what? Many soldiers couldn't even remember why they were fighting anymore. Looking at the Eastern Front, as you guys can see here, a lot of the war, like I said, takes place east of Germany, even east and north of the Balkans. Much of it takes place not quite in St. Petersburg or Moscow. They actually are in the western part of what was Russia back then. And then remember, guys, this is called World War I, not Europe War I. There were all kinds of people who joined this war who were not European. There were other countries that joined the war that were not part of the original alliances. For example, the Ottoman Empire joins the war as well. Why would they do such a thing? Well, uh, at the time, the Ottoman Empire really hated Britain and France. Britain and France, remember, had been like vultures circling over the Ottoman Empire, which was the dying or sick man of Europe. And so the Ottoman Empire thought Germany had a real chance of winning this thing. And they figured if they allied with Germany and took down Britain and France, then that would put a stop to Britain and France's imperial ambitions in the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France were waiting for the Ottoman Empire to fall apart so that they could come in and basically pick up the pieces and claim them as colonies for themselves. Italy also joins the war. Now remember, Italy is actually part of the original Central Powers, but they had not actually joined the war yet. You might recall when we talked about the chain reaction that starts it, Italy didn't join. Where were they? Well, they were actually kind of hesitating and shuffling their feet. They didn't really want to quite get involved yet. There was a feeling of a lack of preparation, or a feeling that this wasn't really our war. And there was a lot of trepidation in Italy. Bulgaria also then joins the war on the side of the Central Powers. Italy, however, decides to finally join the war in 1915. However, they took everybody by surprise. When they come in, they're on the opposite side against their allies. That's right, Italy switched sides. Italy actually had struck a secret deal with Britain. Britain knew that Italy would have really liked to gain some of their own lands that they hadn't quite gained during the unification process in what is now northern Italy. Those areas were still under Austrian control. Britain knows that Italy's alliance with Austria is really uneasy. I mean, Italy joins the alliance with Germany, but Italy and Austria were not actually friendly with each other. You know, there's this history there of Austria oppressing and ruling over Italy. So Italy takes the bait. Italy was very tempted to turn against Austria, and in the hopes of getting the land that they were promised from Britain. Britain said, "Hey, we'll help you get that land from Austria that rightfully belongs to you, since it's, you know, these people speak Italian there, if you join the fight with us rather than against us." And Italy is all for it. So Italy is going to suffer quite a bit also. They're going to take a lot of heat from Germany for switching sides. But this is a global conflict. The Middle East is also involved because, remember, Europe has colonies, and when they need men and resources, they will turn to their colonies to get them. The war was also fought in the Middle East. There were many Middle Eastern countries that joined as well, some of them on the side of Britain, some of them on the side of Germany. As you can imagine, this causes political havoc in the Middle East. And the Middle East has never quite recovered from that. So when we look at everything that's going on in the Middle East today, many of the conflicts that exist today in the Middle East between various countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, the wheels really start turning here in World War I that are going to lead the Middle East into today's path. You might have heard of a British man named Lawrence of Arabia who played a significant role in organizing the military, the British and also Arabian troops in the Middle East. Don't forget that all of Africa by this time had been colonized by Europe, and Britain and France rely on African soldiers to fight in the trenches, as well as Indian sepoy soldiers who fight in British uniforms. These men were taken from their homelands in Africa and India in the Middle East and were sent to fight and die in trenches in northern France. Why did they do it? Well, they didn't really have a choice, but also colonized people thought, if we cooperate, surely they will reward us with our freedom after the war. In fact, many of these countries, these colonized places, were led to believe that the Europeans were willing to give them their freedom if only they just cooperated and participated and helped out in the war first. So this was very frightening, especially for soldiers in Africa. Many of them thought that this would lead to an invasion of their countries, and that, or it would lead to retaliation. For example, in Kenya, which was a British colony at the time, Kenyans lived in fear that Germany would actually invade Kenya in retaliation for supporting the British. So this was a very scary time in Africa and India as well. They lived in fear not only of being recruited to die in a foreign war that they had nothing to do with, but they also lived in fear of retaliation from enemy colonizers. But then also the United States joins the war as well. Now, the United States doesn't actually participate in this war until the very end. In fact, I think we only were really in combat for the last 10 months of the war. But at first, the United States had a strict neutrality policy in World War I. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive Democratic president at the time, and he had maintained a policy of strict neutrality. Woodrow Wilson was a little bit gun-shy about getting the United States involved in foreign wars and foreign affairs, because at the very beginning of his presidency, he actually had gotten the United States involved in some political, let's say, shenanigans in Mexico during Mexico's revolution. And it completely backfired. Wilson ended up backing a candidate for Mexico's president for their new republic who was not popular. He sent American troops to Mexico. This is back in 1914. The whole thing backfired. Germany had actually been involved in that as well, and they had sent a ship to dock in Mexico at the time. And it ended up being this humiliating event for Woodrow Wilson. So his first foray into foreign relations with our own neighbor to the south ended up being a really bad experience for Wilson. So he was like, I don't want to get involved in other countries' problems anymore. But also something to remember is that Britain also had a lot of factories and industries in which there were many American investors involved. America had a lot of business interests in Britain. So America was neutral, but at the same time wanted to support Britain, because if Britain lost the war, American investors might not get any of their profits. So America starts to kind of loosen its neutrality when the Lusitania was sunk. The Lusitania was a ship, a passenger ship, that had many American passengers and British passengers on board, and it had sailed from Ireland, so there were also many Irish passengers. Now, this was supposedly just a passenger ship, not a military ship. But Germany had previously sent a warning that any ships heading to Britain during this time of war were fair game for being torpedoed, right? The German submarines were sinking ships that were going to or from Britain at the time, during this time of war. However, business must go on, and America continued to send some ships, and people continued to travel during this time, kind of similar to how people continue to go out, and go places even though we're in this quarantine. Sometimes, even despite all these public safety warnings, people are going to do what they're going to do because business must go on, I guess. Well, the Lusitania was sunk, and over 100 Americans died, including some really important American business leaders. The United States was really upset about this and sends Germany a warning. And they say, you better stop this or else we're coming after you. At the time, Germany could not afford another enemy, another front to fight. So Germany stood down and stopped bombing American ships, or, other ships at the time as well. And that worked for a little while, but we fast forward to 1917. And the stalemate is still going. We've now been going through this for 3 years. Germany is absolutely desperate to break the stalemate, and so they figure desperate times call for desperate measures, and they decide to resume their unrestricted submarine warfare. This was what they called it, unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning torpedoing ships with submarines. America gets really angry and warns Germany that we're very strongly tempted to now join the war against them. But the straw that broke the camel's back was when some British intelligence officers intercepted a telegram that was sent from Germany to Mexico. Remember I said Mexico is a sore spot for Woodrow Wilson. The Zimmerman telegram is a famous telegram, and it basically was a telegram in which Germany asks Mexico to invade the United States to distract us. And in return, when Germany won the war, they would return the favor by then helping Mexico regain lands that it had lost in the Spanish-American War, in particular California, Texas, and Arizona. Well, the United States wasn't having that. Woodrow Wilson could simply not let that stand. So on April 6, 1917, which, by the way, the anniversary was yesterday since I'm recording this on April 7th, the United States officially enters the war. However, it's important to note, America was not ready. We didn't have the the military numbers necessary. We didn't even have the weapons necessary to join. So we didn't actually arrive in Europe for another few months. So it was a bit of an anticlimactic entry into the war. Speaking of which, weapons and everything, World War I was really a new kind of war. We have new weapons that really hadn't been used before. Airplanes were being used in warfare for the first time. Machine guns had not been used in a war of this scale anyway. Zeppelins, which are like big blimps that are used to transport troops. We don't use them in war anymore because, as it turns out, they're pretty easy to blow up. And also, this is the first time we start to see tanks in a massive scale of war. They were primitive tanks. We also have submarines that were invented by the Germans, that were also known as U-boats or underwater boats. The tanks were first invented by the British, as you guys probably know. So this is what a machine gun looks like in the trenches, right? You just set it up on a tripod, and it doesn't really require a whole lot of skill or aiming. This also really throws a wrench in the plan of how to fight a war, because there's not a whole lot of strategy. You can't do a whole lot of movement or maneuvering when you're up against a machine gun. A machine gun can take out so many troops in a very short amount of time. Speaking of which, here is what a trench really looks like. So as you guys can see, it's much more than simply just a ditch in the ground. It's a sophisticated network. That doesn't make it any better to be in. But if you guys can follow my cursor along, let's say these are the German trenches here in northern France, okay? So let's say that this is the German system of trenches, and way on the other side, to the left of the screen, would be the French or the British trenches. So this is kind of a close-up, cut-out section. But you have your front line trench. This is where a lot of the action happens, and you have troops who are stationed here. There are some dugouts that are pretty primitive. They provide some like rudimentary protection from direct hits, but these things can cave in, and so they're not really quite safe. But here are your troops, and they're stationed, ready to, they're keeping a watch out, ready to fire if necessary. And then you have these other trenches that are connecting to support trenches, where you have your support troops and other supplies. You have deeper dugouts here that could give somebody a little bit more time to cover. This is often where the officers would hang out and plan their next moves or strategies. You've also got, for example, blockhouses, which would house machine guns right in front of the support trenches, of course. On the backside, you got your reserves, and this is where you would go and get some rest if you needed. Troops would not actually be forced to be in the frontline trench for more than a week at a time. Then they would spend 2 weeks outside of the trenches, and they would sometimes go into these reserves. And then these sort of passageways that connect them are communication trenches. Way back here, you've got your long-range artillery, about 10 kilometers behind the front lines. And these guns fire all the way over into enemy lines, right, to kind of soften up. But important to note here, also, of course, you can see aircraft are used to spy as well. These could be shot down. Often you would witness dogfights between planes, where planes would actually try to shoot each other down. And that was also always exciting for the guys to see. What is right here, guarding the frontline trench, is a system of barbed wire. Now, barbed wire is actually not invented for war. It was invented to keep livestock penned up. But it was used in the war as a way to guard against enemy troops from coming into your system of trenches. If you tried to cross the barbed wire, you would get stuck, and then you'd be a sitting duck. And then, of course, here is no man's land. And no man's land is full of craters and churned up debris and mud. This comes from all the falling artillery. And there's nowhere to hide. There are no trees or anything like that. So you just have to run across and somehow on a prayer hope that you don't get shot. If you made it across no man's land and made it to the barbed wire, you had to find somehow an opening in the barbed wire, and soldiers carried wire cutters with them, and you had to somehow cut your way through the wire, but most men didn't make it. In fact, during shelling, sometimes the barbed wire would actually go flying up into the air. A lot of soldiers thought they could blow up the barbed wire. Barbed wire doesn't blow up. Barbed wire shoots straight up into the air if you try to bomb it, and then it lands in a tangled heap on the ground. Now, sometimes soldiers were told to run across no man's land at night. This made it difficult to run at night because you couldn't see where you were stepping. You could break your ankle in one of these holes. And sometimes the only thing that would provide any light at all was the enemy fire, the artillery going off like flashes in the sky. But if you happen to run into a tangled mass of barbed wire, which you might not be able to see clearly, while you're being shot at in the dark of night, and get caught there, you were stuck. You wouldn't be able to escape, and then you were a perfect target for machine gun fire. So as you can imagine, it was incredibly scary. For that reason, many countries involved in the war, in particular Britain at the time, started to pass laws against cowardice, the act of being a coward in war. When soldiers were told to go over the top, they would leave a couple of men behind in the trenches. Those men left behind in the trenches had one job, and that was to shoot any of their own men, their own brothers in arms, for being cowards. Because as you can imagine, being told to go over the top was frightening, and many men, or boys, these were sometimes teenagers, they would chicken out. They would get scared, and they would go running back into the trench for safety. Because you try running towards machine gun fire and bombs, that would be terrifying. So a lot of men would panic and run back to the trench for safety. And they were told, if you run back, not only will you be shot on sight for being a coward, but your name will be left off of memorials, but will be published in the paper, and your entire family will be shamed for your cowardice. So this, as you can imagine, this produced so much anxiety, so much fear. And that's why the men who come home from the war are just ridden with shell shock and trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, which was not widely understood at the time. Here is a photograph taken by a journalist at the time of a man being shot as he's running across no man's land. Just the primitiveness of the war itself. Nobody would ever want to fight a war like this today. It would be pointless. There's some World War I movies out there you can watch, like War Horse. 1917 is amazing. You got to watch it. This one is called Paths of Glory. Many soldiers would actually, Many soldiers would actually have to harden themselves. They came home from the war psychologically changed because of the things that they would have to do that were completely abnormal in regular life. For example, here you see a soldiers using dead bodies and stacking them as a way to guard themselves against enemy fire. So to take those soldiers and then try to reinsert them back into civilian public life after what they had done, many people really quickly realized the true damage that this war did to soldiers who came home alive. There was also a lot of boredom in the trenches, so you spent a lot of downtime just waiting for something to happen, but at the same time dreading that something from happening. Nobody actually wanted the bombing to actually start. The other thing that we start to see in this war is the introduction of poison gas as a weapon. This was also known as mustard gas, and it was invented by the Germans. It's called mustard gas because of its yellowish color, that you could actually literally see it when the canister went off. It was sort of this greenish, yellowish color. That was also why the Germans invented the gas mask to go with it. When gas canisters went off, somebody would yell, "Gas, gas, gas," and everybody would fumble to put their gas mask on really, really quickly. And if you didn't get it on quickly in time, it was a burning agent, so it would not only burn your skin, it could permanently blind you if it got in your eyes. And if you inhaled it, it would actually burn your lungs, and a soldier would choke to death. It was a really painful, horrific way to die. So this war, because it goes on for so long and is so horrific, countries really quickly realized this is not a war that's going to be fought off in the distance and the rest of us can just go on with our daily lives. This was a total war. Total war means all the country's resources go into the war effort. Factories stop what they're doing. They don't produce radios or refrigerators anymore. They now start to produce, tanks and guns and weaponry and gas masks and uniforms and that kind of thing. This actually makes it so that governments become more centralized politically. They actually gain more power. And the economy itself is regimented to put itself towards the war effort. It's kind of similar, more extreme, to what's happening today with COVID-19 and how many factories have actually stopped producing things they normally produce and are now making, for example, cloth masks for healthcare workers. For example, the company that makes baseball uniforms has taken the fabric they would have put towards baseball jerseys and is now using that to make face masks for healthcare workers and nurses. Same thing with the furniture company Living Spaces, which sells a lot of upholstered furniture, is now taking their upholstery and using it for making cloth masks. So it's kind of a similar situation. That's why many people feel like right now feels like a war. Total war also means conscription. That means a draft. So the draft starts, and men over the age of 18 were drafted. However, as they got more desperate for troops, they started to sort of look the other way or pretend to not know that younger and younger men were signing up for the war. The youngest known soldier to ever serve in the war was a 13-year-old British soldier. 13. Of course, it's going to affect the economy. The economy obviously becomes very volatile. People at home have to start rationing their food. This leads to nationalization of industries as governments take over things like mines and electric power plants and factories, communication industries. Not everybody did this well. Some countries were better suited for this than others. For example, Britain does a slightly better job of this than, let's say, Russia. And so Germany actually does this pretty well. They have what's called a planned economy, where they had already started to kind of efficiently shift to a wartime economy. Britain and France, they see a dramatic increase in the power of their central governments as everything is put into the war effort itself. You don't see as much success in Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These countries struggle a lot more with their economic efficiency and their economies during the war. And that's why Austria and Italy will probably suffer economically after the war as well, more so than the other countries. Here's an example of how soldiers from around the war fought. These are French soldiers from Senegal. Senegal was a French colony at the time, and as you can see, these guys probably have no idea who Franz Ferdinand is or even care and really have not much to do. They're sort of just innocent bystanders of the growing nationalism in Europe that led to this war. But here they are giving up their lives to fight in this war that they had nothing to do with. Here are some American soldiers as well. Now, while America joins the war basically willingly, they also come home. American soldiers also come home with a different attitude about war than they had beforehand. This was no picnic for anybody who was involved. So, total war is going to have an impact on people's lives, just like we're having our personal lives impacted right now by this pandemic. Of course, during a total war, you're going to have the same thing. For example, a lot of people were suffering economically, and this led to a lot of political unrest. People wanted to go on strike, and the governments could not allow that to happen. And so there was a lot of dealing with unrest, a lot of policing in the streets. There were some strikes and revolutionary upheavals in places, but governments would not tolerate these things. Even in the United States, freedom of speech was suspended during the wars, both wars, World War I and World War II. Liberals and socialists often were opposed to the war, usually because this war was seen as an imperial war, which they were against anyway. So you see a lot of liberals and socialists end up in jail for speaking out against the war. Like I said, freedom of speech is suspended. Freedom of the press was, the press had to make the war sound good for the most part to support the war effort. In Britain, we start to see, for example, laws take place that will give the police more militant powers. And then, of course, in propaganda. So you need to have people support the war. And so, because there was a lot of like fading enthusiasm as the war dragged on longer and longer and longer, enthusiasm for the war started to fade. So governments launched these extensive propaganda campaigns. Um, there were some also social impacts of the war as well. For example, workers benefited from this because workers suddenly became very important. Um, you know, there was no more unemployment; everyone had a job. The trade unions became more powerful as they were able to demand. They had a lot more power, so they had more bargaining power to demand, for example, better conditions. Women also end up going to war, and they are able to demand even equal pay for the important jobs they're doing. After all, it was the women who manufactured the guns and the ammunition and the equipment for the war, even the uniforms. They did achieve some things. They did not gain equality, but especially since after the war they were removed from the workforce anyway. However, World War I does help them get suffrage finally in countries like Britain and World War I. It took World War I and women proving their worth in the political sector as participants in a wartime effort to finally get the right to vote. Britain, Germany, Austria, and the United States all ended up giving women a right to vote after World War I. But it also exacerbates social hierarchies, especially, for example, in a place like Britain, where the majority of soldiers who were sent to die in the front lines were from poorer areas, and the men who were, of the nobility or aristocratic classes, they often were the more privileged officers who didn't see as much face-to-face combat. That's not to say that no nobles or aristocrats died in the war, because they did, but it was pretty clear that the poor were seen as more expendable. It's also important to note that in Britain, World War I is really important to Britain because it changes how they view war. It had a major impact. An entire generation of men was lost. And this also changes how the British fought in wars. During World War I, British battalions or groups of soldiers were grouped together by their hometown. So, for example, if we're talking about the United States in that war, if the United States was Britain during World War I, like an entire battalion of troops would be made up of just boys from Walnut Creek, and another one of boys, and they'd all be from Concord. Another group would all be from Oakland or from Marinda. And so this was done as a way to kind of keep this sort of sense of camaraderie. And it maybe they felt like if all these boys were fighting from the same hometown, it would give them, enthusiasm or make them feel like they were really supporting each other. But that didn't work in this war because of, once again, the machine guns and the weapons were used could mow down an entire battalion. So if you could imagine back home in these hometowns, like let's say Devon or, Hampshire or these other sort of towns or Surrey in England, and every mother and wife in that town on the same day would get a telegram saying that their husband or son or father was dead. The impact this had on towns in England to lose all of their young men in a single day was often devastating. And this did not help for enthusiasm in the war. As I said, this makes central governments very powerful. Here we see some German military heroes of the war, including Paul von Hindenburg, who will become important in the lead up to World War II. These guys become so powerful that eventually they're basically seen as military dictators. They are the ones really calling the shots here, not the king, not the prime minister or the chancellor, but these military generals are really in charge of everything now. Here's some examples of the propaganda that we see. For example, this is a British propaganda poster showing a young man saying, "Hey, enlist now because you're fighting for your hometown." The irony, of course, being that hometown would soon lose almost all of their young men. Ireland also fought in World War I. It's important to note that in 1916, during the war, Ireland will revolt against Britain and fight for its independence due to some conflicts between British soldiers and Irish soldiers and the ongoing oppression against the Irish by the British. But before that happened, the Irish had participated in World War One. So here are some examples. For the glory of Ireland, will you go or must I? This is a common propaganda tactic where women are used as a sort of um, bait to get men to enlist in the war and a sort of challenge to their masculinity. The idea was you weren't a real man unless you enlisted in the war. Here's another one. Some of you who have really keen eyes might have seen, I have this one actually posted in my classroom above my desk, where Irishmen are told to avenge the sinking of the Lusitania. Remember, that was that ship that sunk, that had departed from Ireland and killed many American and British passengers as well. I should also say, by the way, that the Lusitania was a passenger ship, which is technically illegal. You're not supposed to shoot those down in times of war. But recently it was discovered that the Lusitania was, in fact, carrying war materials, which made it technically legal for the Germans to actually shoot it down. Here we see some women as munition workers in British factories. Like I said, women get all these new economic opportunities, and their contribution to the war was priceless. They're the ones who manufacture all the guns and weapons and uniforms and all that. This gives a country that hadn't really had this before a newfound respect for the female worker who basically keeps the country running at home while her father or husband or son is fighting off in the war. So I'm going to stop it there. I will be posting some other lessons. Go away. I will be posting some other lessons on which we're going to analyze some documents which are really important. I hope that this gives you a really good idea of what war was like in trench war and why it's the worst kind of war you could possibly fight. That's not to say that trench wars were not fought again afterwards. Much of World War II was fought from trenches as well. But it was the trench warfare in particular that made World War I such a disaster because of the fact that it led to this definitive stalemate and lasted way longer than anyone thought it would last. And in doing so, drained every country that participated in it of not only its money, but also its men. That's why the men who, or the people who survived after World War I during the 1920s and 30s were nicknamed the Lost Generation. So with that, guys, I'm going to post a question for you guys in Google Classroom, and I hope that you will participate in the discussion. And I will see you in my next one, in which we will analyze some World War I poetry and journalism.